At the outset, I pay tribute to the Valuations Office accounting officer who, for a period, while matters were being managed better, actually did the job without cost to the state and was extremely helpful in terms of understanding the workings of that office when he came before the Public Accounts Committee. I think that he had given great service to the state and extended that service by doing the work as he did without pay. I welcome the introduction of the bill, but you have to go to the very end of this bill to understand that really what it's setting out to do is to strengthen the numbers in the office, valuation office, provide appropriate IT structures and so on to enable the work to be undertaken. And then, of course, there are various amendments or various sections to the bill which essentially talk about the office itself, the Commissioner, and what the Commissioner shall or shall not be able to do. My main concerns about the bill is that it doesn't go far enough at all and doesn't deal with the issues that are today being dealt with by businesses up and down the country. The cost of creating a job through the IDA runs at roughly €13,000. The SMEs in this country at one time created close to 1 million jobs. They tailored all of their costs, they cut back where it was necessary, and they ensured that they were competitive. And the one single cost that they could not cut back on was the rates. Regardless of what happened, regardless of their turnover, regardless of the challenges that they faced, particularly during the period 2007 onwards right up to today, they were unable to cut the costs of commercial rates. And in my opinion, that just indicates to those that are involved in the SME sector, in creating those jobs, the small businesses, the families, the individuals that are central to the recovery in terms of our economy, were by and large ignored and were not assisted either by central government or by local government. And I think that that is a reflection on the attitude that the state has in relation to collecting taxes, because this is a tax that has no bearing on your turnover, that has no bearing on your ability to pay, and that simply is an extraction, a fairly direct extraction of money from businesses into the coffers of the local authority. And I would like to see that change. And I think that the activities of the Valuation Office in terms of the revaluation process has shown clearly that it would take decades to complete what is necessary all around the country. And the starting point is that regardless of what happens in a county, whether the rate on particular businesses goes up or down, the take from the process must be the same. So the concern for bureaucracy and local government is, well, our take in 2013 was €1.47 billion. That cannot be reduced in any significant way. So whatever you do, do nothing about that amount. And all you're doing is shifting around the pieces on the board, pieces that represent businesses, families, individuals, and putting pressure on them to continue to pay a rate that is above and beyond the demand that should be on them. And I say that because most of the construction, newly constructed premises, came about during the period 2007 onwards. Massive construction. And the rates that were applied to those buildings were rates that reflected the values of the properties at the time, the commercial activity at the time, and the ability of those within that business sector to pay. They're still paying the same level of rates. And unless you have an understanding of what is going on in business by the local authority, they will continue to pursue you for 100% of that rate. Some local authorities have engaged with the business sector and have reduced the rate on the building by an amount equal to the space not being used. But there is argument for them to do even more, because the businesses are still not able to pay. So it's not only about the space that you use, it's also about the profits that you make and the ability of you to pay the rates. Subsequent occupier clause is another area that was seriously contentious over the years, where properties remain vacant because the outstanding rates could not be sorted out. So the landlord owed the rates, or he was left, if you like, with the bill for the rates after the tenant moved out. Those rates stayed in demand as far as the council was concerned, and because of that legal issue, properties were neglected, properties were not let, and again it shows a clear misunderstanding of the SME sector in this country. And again, that needs to be said loud and clear, because if we are to get any change here, it has to be based on the ability to pay, the performance of the business. Why should a local authority have within its power the ability to take 1.47 billion euros in 2013 and have absolutely no intention of examining, could that man, that woman, that family, that individual, that company pay those rates? Because remember, they're paying taxes as well. They're creating employment. And in my opinion, it's been considered a soft touch for too long, and it needs to be explored, taken asunder, and a greater recognition put into place whereby ability to pay is essential. There are other areas in relation to these rates that cause concern, and that is, if you were lucky during the course of the better times to build an extension to your premises, to refurbish it, to take the risk and create employment or introduce new services, the first thing that happened after you got planning permission, having paid your fees, having paid all of the other charges imposed on you by the local authority, was you got a rate assessment. So the person that just trundled on in their business and did little but just had a turnover paid a lower level of rate than the guy up the street who was and is an entrepreneur doing business, creating jobs. He was penalised, or she was penalised, by the taxation system through the commercial rate reassessment. The biggest single issue in the country today, as outlined by my colleague Robert Troy last night, is creches. The cost of childcare, the cost of keeping those creches open to enable people to go back to work. Sometimes they're going back to work to service a mortgage. In most cases, if not all cases, it's a question of servicing debt caused by mortgage, caused by personal debt. And the state has to have an understanding that that personal debt, while it's being serviced, is also causing difficulties within families. And they have to pay huge amounts of money in terms of the care of their children. And in order to deal with that, a simple process would be to exempt all of these educational centres from the payment of rates. That would be an act by the state that will be recognised by that sector in relation to the costs that are involved and that are being borne by the parents around this country that are making a genuine effort. The same could be said of sporting organisations. What do you intend to do with a sporting centre, a club, an organisation that has a licence, that has become a community centre? We have devastated rural Ireland by supporting policies that close the local pub, the local grocery store, the local post office. Nothing is left in some of these villages bar the GAA or some other sporting organisation, but mainly it's the GAA. And they have availed of grants. They have put every effort into galvanising a community in the interests of the children and the next generation, in the interest of some social activity that will rebuild a community structure. And I believe that the general property in relation to all of those grounds should be exempted from rates. Yes, if there's a bar or something there, maybe there should be a special consideration of that particular facility. And the ones that would argue against all of what I've said will do so on the basis that we're taking money from the state. We're reducing our tax take. So I would say to that we are asking that tax take in the context of commercial rates be reduced. And let's not be afraid to confront that particular argument. But it should be reduced on the basis that in terms of the local businesses that are pushed against the wall with taxation, that have nowhere else to turn, are creating jobs, they're sustaining jobs, they're the centres of community, and they are often families who work for hours way above and beyond what is required of them to keep a local community enterprise going, to remain at the heart of a community and to give it some hope and services. Look how Ireland has changed in terms of its villages and towns. They've been devastated. And I'm suggesting that the commercial rate is part and parcel of that problem. It isn't the only cause, but it certainly is a great cause, and it's a cause of concern for them. The other issue I would want to raise here, Lascian Corla, is that of the local government audit. And I would suggest that if there were savings made in terms of how local government is administered, and if the rate was really left to local authorities, that they could stimulate their own local economy by being in a position to take the political decision to reduce rates. And I think that that would be a good thing. It brings back the power, essentially, of valuation, be it self-evaluation or not, and the striking of the rate to an elected body of people that have been put there by the people, and that they then can respond in a way that is dealing with, in a direct way, the demands of a local economy. And for years in this House, we have been talking about the local government and the reform that's necessary in local government. Well, let's change this legislation, and let's give to the local authorities the ability to do all of the changes, including commercial rates, that are necessary. Because most of this is compiled by bureaucrats. It's then handed, if you like, as a completed deal to the local authorities, and they can't walk away from it. It's accepted or rejected. And I'd ask, how many consultations took place, or how many groups were consulted in relation to this piece of legislation? How many business people, big and small, were brought into a room and asked, what do you think of this legislation? And what changes would you make to the legislation to make it better, or to expand it, or to deal in general terms with the commercial rate. Because remember, on top of that commercial rate is the water charges that are being applied in local authorities. €3 per cubic metre, water in, water out, and everything is being pushed on that local businesses. Ask yourself, when you're striking this rate, or when you're agreeing with this legislation, how many inspections take place now in a business? Health and safety, the HSE, and depending on the business then, you could have many other inspectors, including, on top of that, the revenue and, dare I mention, NERA. That's what business is dealing with today. And it's objecting to it, because on the basis of not being consulted, on the basis of the ones that are paying the greatest amount of tax, creating the jobs, and sometimes doing it by personal input, because all of the costs are not covered in terms of what an individual or a family might put into the SME, the small business that they are running. There is no understanding, and that is the problem here in this House. And regardless of how we appeal to the government at the time, and I did it when we were in government over there, there is still very little understanding of what goes into the creation and the maintenance of a small business. And this bill shows that misunderstanding or lack of understanding actually continues. It continues. And any reform that comes in here is always based on how much are we getting now, what reform will we introduce once it doesn't reduce our take, and the whole issue is that the state is taking too much from businesses in this country, and we keep on saying to them, and we're relying on you to rebuild the economy and to create the jobs. There is a contradiction that has to be confronted. And I'm asking you, Minister, and the Cabinet to confront the contradiction that exists in this bill and to talk to the SME sector and bring about something that's more fair and that's more equitable and that has been built on or based on their ability to pay. The last thing I want to say, Lasky and Cora, because I still have time left, is that when you lump the rates on top of the cost of a lease, it is phenomenal what you are paying out in costs. And the other commitment given by government before it was elected was to end the upward-only rent reviews. And yet, Bewley's, as it was affected by the upward-only rent reviews, nobody said anything about it in this House. 100+ jobs gone, and nobody has said anything. How long did it take to create that enterprise? How many millions did it take to maintain that enterprise? And that's just one example. And yet that business was allowed to close. And some of these examples, some of these businesses, in terms of the properties that they maintain, or lease, these properties are often owned by banks or pension funds that are untouchable. And I would appeal to the Minister to reach out and touch them, bring them in, and break the upward-only rent review clause. Every other individual landlord in the country has had to confront that problem. And to keep tenants, they've had to reduce the rents. They've had to do it. And they've been successful, some of them. Instead of what's happening now, where you have a tenant like Bewley's, or like the many others that have been mentioned, keep them in there, screw them for the highest rent possible because you're supported by a lease which is immoral. The government said they would do something about it, and I'm suggesting that now is the time, or past time, that they would intervene and sort out that issue once and for all, before some of, or more of, our high street entities and enterprises are closed and taken off the face of the business spectrum. That is what is facing us. And I would say this about every street in every urban area in the country. They are so challenged that a lot of them have closed. Drive through any street or village in cities or towns throughout the country and you'll find nothing, only pubs, post offices, small shops boarded up. We need to do something to reignite rural Ireland, and part of it would be an understanding from local government and central government that something needs to be done in relation to rates, upward-only rent reviews and any other issue that confronts the SME sector in order to encourage them to employ more and maintain themselves as a business for the future.